Welcome to Charlie Sykes to the contrary and continuing our conversations about what's happening with Trump 2.0. And I wanted to start, I haven't spoken to you recently, but we've had a week of thinking about 100 days
Yeah.
and what the 100 days. And I'm curious, I mean, you've been involved and followed Republican politics, but if you think of Presidents Reagan and both Bushes, how does this 100 days compare in your mind to what those 100 days of those different presidents was about?
Well, the only 100 days that it can reasonably be compared to, of course, is FDR's, and even that doesn't really work given the assault on all the institutions. I think that we we initially were overwhelmed by the shock and awe, the speed of the aggressiveness of it. I think that ultimately, though, I'm getting a sense that we're kind of finding our legs, but I'm interested in asking you a question as well, because I was at a seminar up in Boston yesterday, and somebody said, "Is this a generational crisis that we're in, or an historical crisis we're in?" And my answer was that I think it's historical, because you do have the feeling that this is kind of a hinge of history, and that whatever happens, this country is going to emerge from this test very differently than it was 100 years ago.
I think that's right. I mean, when you have this kind of threat to institutions, it becomes historical, not just generational.
Yeah,
And institutional damage is very hard to undo, or it takes a long time. Back to FDR, I mean, that was a period of institutional building
yeah,
and creation. And so I think whether you're talking about the threats to the Constitution as an institution, which will be hard to undo. You
yeah,
expose weaknesses, they're always going to be remembered, or threats to institutions like the media, like the universities, pick your institution. That is really inflicting a lot of damage. And so that's the foundation of our period of history. And so that's why I see it as much more than
no,
just a generational moment.
well, I agree with you, and you look back on what happened, and on one level, we should not have been surprised, given the fact that Donald Trump told us who he was and what he was going to do. They wrote it down in Project 2025. I think the the breadth of it and the speed took people by surprise, but I think the biggest surprise of the first 100 days, I think, unfortunately, was how much it exposed about the fragility of our ability to resist this kind of an attack. The number of surrenders that we've talked about before, the media, the universities, at least initially, the big law firms. The billionaire oligarchs, all of whom felt the need to bend the knee, because there was a sense that suddenly we were dealing with a federal government or a president who had no limits, no guardrails, that the imperial president had become imperial. And I think that was the thing that put people back to suddenly realize that the resistance was so paper thin. And all of these institutions were so fragile. So I think that was the real shock of the first 100 days. But perhaps we're seeing now that law of physics, that the harder you push something, the greater the resistance.
What do you think it does? And you've talked about this and written about it before, but in terms of conservatism as a governing philosophy, as a part of a movement since the 70s, what is this particular moment in your mind doing to the kind of standing and legitimacy of conservative politics?
Well, it's a complete abandonment of it. I mean, we've seen this before, but it was really, on really graphic display. I mean, the changing sides in the Cold War was certainly an indication, but also the use of government power, of fear and favor. I mean, one of the basics of conservative thought was always limited government, free markets, constitutional order. All of those things have been shattered. And by the way, there have been so many moments, but I have to say that Donald Trump's war on Barbie was again one of these clarifying moments where you have the president who campaigned on lowering the price of things, saying, well, maybe Americans have too much stuff. Maybe we should have less stuff that should cost more money, and that maybe kids don't need 30 Barbies, maybe they need two Barbies. Now, just first of all, if I don't have an opinion on what the right number of Barbies is, but it used to be that conservatives would have understood that that's a choice that people in the marketplace make. That would be a choice that parents and individuals would make. If a Democrat had said something remotely like that any time in the last 40 years, conservative minds would have exploded. The right wing media would have been on it 24/7. If you imagine, can you imagine if Joe Biden had said that, or Kamala Harris had said that, or Barack Obama had said, you people, you don't need that many dolls, you don't need that many anything. And that was one of those moments where you realize there's no connection between many of the things he's doing and anything remotely like American conservatism post World War II. Nothing.
I mean, it's even in many ways, it's more aggressive in its use of government than liberalism. I mean, that's what's
Yeah,
incredible. This is
it is.
direct intervention in the economy through strong arm trade tactics. It's using federal money as leverage to get what you want here and there. And it's just even him being omnipresent in
Right.
American life. I mean, it's just like Reagan says in '81, government is not the solution to the problems, it's the problem, and that's a bad paraphrase.
Well, no,
Um,
right.
but like here he is embodying strong arm government without a vision of anything. And I mean, the Barbie's also interesting, Charlie,
Mhm.
in that it just showed a complete lack of empathy, which we expect from of all the. I know it was talking about toys, but of all the things to pick, the dolls for a
Right.
kid.
It was a very strange thing, and out of touch, especially the fact that you're this billionaire president sitting in this gold, gaudy Oval Office that looks like it was designed by Saddam Hussein, talking about, yeah, you kids don't need dolls, of all the things to think about. But you're right, and I think that one of the phrases that I remember back from the before times was that conservatives said government should not pick the winners and losers in the economy. That is the essence of a free market. Well, quite literally on a daily basis, Donald Trump very openly is picking the winners and losers. You kiss the ring, you will get exemptions. You will get, favor. If you do not kiss the ring, he will use the full power of government to destroy you. Um, I think the conservatives would have been absolutely horrified if a Democratic president would have issued executive orders stripping um, private institutions, think tanks, foundations, churches of their tax exempt status because of their speech. This would have horrified people. Now there are elements that, as you know, I mean, going back into what I've called the recessive gene of the right, the nativism, the law and
Yep.
order, the all of those things that have a sort of a veneer and muscle memory of conservative politics. But the essence of it is so aggressively the consolidation of all power in one person is just not part of that tradition. And also, I'm sorry to go on, but
No.
the disappearance of Congress,
Yeah.
and the attacks on the courts and the way that it's going on would have been shocking. Well, as you know, would have been shocking to any previous generation.
Do you think there's variation in the states? I mean, when you look at the Republican landscape, is this a national story or is this now also what you'd find in red states, essentially kind of supporting this vision of strong conservative government? It's not just strong government, it's also ad hoc,
Right.
day to day. But do you think this is now broad, or do you see any areas where, okay, there's some Republicans who are not exactly thinking this way?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, obviously there is that aggressive use of government power. You saw that with DeSantis, who was trying to say, "I can be Trump." Trumpism without Trump, and he was using that kind of the bully pulpit, including going after private companies, private institutions for speech he didn't like. But there's a lot about the Trump era that's not that you can't replicate at the state level. You can't replicate the cult of personality or the power that the president has. I don't know. I would have to do more reading on this, but I doubt there are many governors that have the kind of sweeping power that the president has complete control over all of the institutions, including independent agencies, including the departments of justice. So I'm not sure, but there's no question about it that the entire Republican Party, up and down, has been Trumpified. And to the extent that there was an establishment or a more traditional Republican Party, it's been basically purged with one exception, and it's a very, very important exception, and
What's
that's
that?
the federal judiciary. There are still old line conservatives, including some of the Federalist Society folks, who come from a different generation, and they're still there. They've been purged from governorships, they've been purged from Congress and the Senate, but guys like J. Harvey Wilkinson are still around, and I think you're starting to feel the impact of that.
Why do you think that is? I've been noting that, and even the Trump appointed judge who just kind of ruled against them. What is it
Yeah.
about those judges that kind of allows them to understand a much more circumscribed vision of what the government should do, and also respect, the civil liberties and those traditions of American life?
Well, the obvious answer is lifetime tenure, is the fact
Yeah.
that they can't be purged, they can't be primaried out. But also, there was an understanding, and I think that, by the way, this was misunderstood on both ends of the political spectrum. There was a tradition of very, very principled constitutionalism. I mean, there are the ideologues, the result oriented ideologues like Sam Alito. They've always been those types, and there's that on the left as well. But I think there's also been a lot of people who had grown up with a deep respect for the rule of law. Now, they may have been named by a Republican president, but they did not see their role as delivering MAGA victories. Donald Trump fundamentally didn't understand that. And by the way, I'm a little concerned how that's going to go going forward. But he honestly believed that if he appointed people, that they would be loyal to him, or that a conservative judge meant a right wing judge who would deliver right wing victories. That's not been the tradition so far, and I think you're seeing that. I mean, you of course you do have the stray Eileen Cannon down in Florida. You haven't heard that name in a while, but you also have a lot of people who are sitting around, very, very conservative judges like Judge Wilkinson, who are watching this attack, and you're starting to see it show up, not just in the old Republican judges, but in the Trump appointed judges, and that will include the U.S. Supreme Court.
The other thing I'm always thinking about, and this week it became a story with the polls, is how immune is he? And we're not with him, so it's reading. But how immune is he from the normal pushbacks of American politics? Meaning his polls were really bad. You're not just talking about disapproval; you're talking about polls showing people find him scary.
Yeah.
Independents are really not very happy with him, and then obviously economic instability caused by him rather than something he's dealing with. Is he someone in your mind who just won't care, or does secretly you think he has an eye on some of this?
Well, he has an eye on it, but he cares less than other conventional politicians would. I mean, in theory, he's a lame duck, although I don't necessarily buy that anymore. Republicans are going to stick with him no matter what, so he doesn't have to worry about losing congressional support. But I do think that public opinion matters in the context of the moment. And going back to what I said about the shock of all of these institutions and individuals capitulating to him, they capitulated because they thought he was unstoppable. They capitulated because he had all of this power and that resistance was futile. One of the things that might happen is that as it becomes very clear that he is out of sync with public opinion, that it will give many of these institutions, I'm talking about universities, law firms, will give them second thoughts about whether or not they really do want to be perceived as surrendering to him, whether they really and collaborating with him. So I think that you might see it strengthening civil society's willingness to push back. Now, polls will also give you an indication of what will happen in the midterms, and that will have a significant effect. He doesn't want to be impeached again. I would think, but so I do think that yes, public opinion matters, whether it matters to him or not. Now there are other things that matter, including the markets. I mean, I honestly believed. I think maybe we talked about this. I thought he was going to fire Jerome Powell, and the markets basically said, "Don't even think about it." and you saw how fast he backed off. So there are times when either public opinion or the markets, where even Donald Trump, who's all out of F's to give, will pay attention.
And I mean, I keep thinking that Republicans on the Hill are also they're keeping their eye on this because wherever he is, they want to win re-election. They want to stay in office. Not all of them, but some of them. And at some point, they're going to make themselves vulnerable. So there must be a break, just a pure political breaking point where they're thinking about the midterms or they're thinking about the next presidential election. And unless he does something that reverses
Yeah.
his standing. I mean, some of those senators are gonna be, looking at the possibility of losing their seats.
Right. So there may be some,
Yeah.
although having been having this conversation for the last 10 years,
Right.
Lucy in the football, I'm not tremendously hopeful. And I want to make this distinction that and a former elected official made this to me because I made the same point. Look, I mean, you see this tsunami coming. Why would you not get out of the way? In Republican politics today, there's a big distinction between losing for reelection to a Democrat and losing in a primary because you bucked Donald Trump. If you lose to a Democrat in a way, you're still in a Republican in good standing. You are still part of that world. You're still eligible for an appointment or some sort of your life goes on. If you break with Donald Trump and you lose in the primary, you not only have lost your seat, you are now excommunicated. You are now cast into outer darkness. And there are a lot of them who are going, okay, I may be going down, but at least I'll still be part of this club. Maybe I'll get to be the ambassador to Cyprus or something. But don't count too much on Republicans breaking before the midterms with him because at a certain point they kind of need to huddle together. And I think that's one of the reasons why they probably will get their budget through. They probably will get their tax cuts through because at least they want to accomplish something. Um, after, I mean, how long have we been waiting? I mean, let's put it this way. This is a Republican Party that did not take an off ramp after the 2020 election and didn't take an off ramp after January 6th. So they're not going to take
Oh, I lost your sound.
tariff
Yep.
problems.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I mean, on the civil society, that's the other part of this. And I think, part of it is the say no or being oppositional's infectious argument.
Right.
But it's also clear that I think most institutions are realizing, they're liked a lot more than the president understands.
Yeah.
I think I said that at some point that they're institutions for a reason, and we depend on them. And B, I think people are realizing institutional leaders, you can't hide. There was an early, I think, assumption if you just keep your head low, it'll be another
Right.
institution. But I think there's a realization this is broad, this will continue. And if you take the tax exempt status away from Harvard, for example, it will be used on another institution, educational or something else.
Right.
And I think the stakes of this are becoming much more apparent at this point.
I no, I think that's exactly right, and I think that people thought that surrender would give them a certain amount of safety, and what they're realizing is that first of all, it makes it more dangerous because it emboldens these guys, and that if you don't hang together, he's going to pick you off one at a time. The other thing is that the opportunity cost for surrender is rising. There was a moment there where
Hmm.
the Paul Weisses of the world thought, okay, here's all the downsides to standing up against Donald Trump. Let's cut our losses. Now they're starting to realize that, well, wait, if we bend the knee to Donald Trump, there's going to be downstream effects. We might actually lose some of our clients. Law students are not could be willing to come and work here, and the reputational damage could last a long time. I mean, yeah, you fight Trump, next couple of years might be really, really ugly. You become Vichy Trump, and the reputational damage might be generational.
And how you follow the conservative media more than I do. Um, how have they been covering the 100 days and how are they covering the kinds of questions we're talking about from Fox to other forms of social media?
Well, yeah, I mean, you need to divide it up between, the MAGA media and the sort of remnant of actual conservative media. I mean, MAGA media has doubled down on being a propaganda source. It's kind of got a North Korean TV vibe to it in many cases. But like the conservative judiciary, you are seeing a number of outlets, including National Review, which has been sort of Trump adjacent, going, what are you thinking here? The tariffs are a disaster. The Putinism is a disaster. The way that you're going about, even trashing due process. So I do think that there's some pushback now on the Wall Street Journal editorial page as well. On the other hand, how influential are they in conservative politics anymore? So there has been that. There's also sort of a stream of like the Joe Rogan types
Mhm.
who I think are starting to have doubts about the attacks on civil liberties, who are cringe at the deportation. There are others who may like the Trumpian agenda, but are growing increasingly concerned about the chaos and the incompetence and the crazy. And the okay, I heard one podcaster say something like, "I would give you an A minus on the agenda, but in terms of implementation, like a C minus because you guys look like you can't get your act together." So the incompetence of governance is undermining, I think, some of the confidence in what's happening. So it depends who you talk about, but I think that he and others remain confident that they'll keep the broad right wing ecosystem because there's always a liberal who's worse, right? There's always somebody you can cherry pick who is more egregious.
And the last thing I wanted to talk about is we're 80 years out of the post World War II order that came together after the war as the Cold War starts with institutions that we have depended on and alliances that have really, I think many would agree, kept not only stable system but prevented nuclear war in the worst moments. I think many people also agree right now that is a historic threat that we are facing. And I'm curious, and that was a bipartisan
Was.
an area of bipartisan agreement that someone like Reagan very much embraced. Kind of what are the stakes right now if that 80-year-old system really falls apart because of the way he's pulling out of all of this?
Well, I mean, as you put it, that 80-year system has, made us prosperous and safe. We have taken it for granted, and unfortunately, I think we forget that. And that 80-year system, I think, is being destroyed. I think that is the stake here. Um, and it's funny that you should bring this up because I've actually been reading. You're the historian. I'm the geek. Actually, went back and read Dean Acheson's book, "President at the Creation." And some of the memoirs of Senator Vandenberg, who was a staunch Republican senator from Michigan, who had been a big isolationist before World War II, but became one of the architects of the post World War II bipartisan consensus. And I think what reminds me is you read is how fragile it was. I
Yeah.
mean, and it was created. It didn't just emerge, from the forehead of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1945. It was a near-run thing, and yet we benefited from it, and we took it for granted. And now Donald Trump, I look his understanding of history and how the world works is incredibly limited, but he's shattering all those institutions, and you see this that our allies, NATO allies, see it the same way, that they don't know that they can trust and rely on the United States anymore. I think David Frum had the best analogy. He said the world was willing to cut us, some slack. The first time we mixed, Quaaludes with tequila, it was like, we'll
Mm.
never do that again. We promise. Elect Donald Trump once. Okay, that was an aberration. We're back. And now we've mixed the Quaaludes with the tequila again, and
Yeah.
they're beginning to say, okay, you have a real problem, and we need to go our own way. And so that is the end of that 80-year experiment. I'm
There's a
afraid.
to your point, there's a great book. Now we're going real deep, but
Yeah.
a historian named Michael Hogan wrote a book called "A Cross of Iron" many years ago, and it was about just how fragile and difficult it was to get that national security state in place because there was a lot of resistance. People like Senator Robert Taft did not want
Yeah.
any of this, and it was always there. And I think what we're seeing is what you said. It was, oh, even through this day, it was fragile. It was something that needed to be nurtured and continue to be nurtured. And I think now we're watching it. Tequila and Quaaludes may be the way to think of it,
Right.
taken apart piece by piece.
Well, I mean, that and it was a bipartisan consensus.
Yep.
When you think of various pivot points of history, since we're going back in this, the isolationist America First stream has always been in Republican politics. But starting in 1940, when Wendell Willkie became the nominee,
Yep.
the Republican Party made common cause. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was able to have a bipartisan policy because of Republicans like Wendell Willkie. And then Robert Taft was the number one isolationist, but he didn't get the nomination. It was Dwight Eisenhower. So through history, there was this bipartisan choice that kept us going. But that's what's been broken. When Donald Trump came in and broke that entire tradition, and there really is, for people who think, and again, people are tired of hearing me talk about this, but Ronald Reagan was in that tradition, maybe with a twist to it, but Donald Trump is very much a departure from that.
Well, Charlie, it's always good to talk, and I love these conversations. They're always very helpful. So I'm looking forward to the next time we do it.
Hey,
Thanks.
anytime. Thank you.
Thanks for joining. Talk to you soon. Bye bye.
Thank you.